There is a man who has spent his entire adult life studying human suffering. Not as an abstract concept, not as a philosophical curiosity to be debated in university hallways, but as the central question of his existence. He sat across from broken people for decades. He listened to stories of abuse, addiction, failure, and despair. He read every great thinker who ever wrestled with why life is so brutally hard. He wrote books that sold tens of millions of copies. He stood on stages in front of sold-out arenas on every continent and gave people something they had been starving for, a serious, honest, unflinching language for the pain that was quietly destroying them. Hundreds of millions of people watched his lectures. Young men who had been told their suffering did not matter suddenly felt seen. Families found a framework to talk about things they had never been able to name. A generation found a voice. And then the suffering came for him. Not as a metaphor. Not as an intellectual problem to be solved with the right framework. It came as a physical reality so severe, so relentless, so completely resistant to every tool he had spent a lifetime building, that the people who love him spent the last year wondering in the silence of sleepless nights whether he was going to make it. What happened to Jordan Peterson is not what anyone expected. And the truth is harder and more important than any headline has ever come close to telling. To understand where Jordan Peterson is right now, you have to understand where he came from. Not the famous version of him, not the cultural figure who became a flashpoint for every debate about free speech and masculinity and identity over the last decade, but the actual human being who was formed long before any of that. He was born in 1962 in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. He grew up in Fairview, a small town in the northern Alberta prairie, the kind of place where winters feel endless and the silence between people and the rest of the world is both geographical and something deeper. He was a quiet, intense child. The kind of boy who read everything he could get his hands on and asked questions that made the adults around him visibly uncomfortable. Not because he was trying to be difficult, because he genuinely needed to understand. Why do people suffer? Why do they do terrible things to each other? Why does meaning feel so fragile and yet so necessary at the same time? These were not questions that passed with age. They became his life's work. He studied political science at the University of Alberta before something pulled him toward psychology in a way that he has described less as a career choice and more as a compulsion. He completed his doctorate at McGill University in Montreal, one of the most rigorous academic environments in the country, and eventually joined the faculty at Harvard University. He taught and researched there for years before returning to Canada to take a position at the University of Toronto. His academic focus was on the psychology of belief, on mythology, on religious symbolism, on the deep historical roots of totalitarianism and ideological possession. He was trying to answer the question that had haunted him since childhood. How do ordinary people end up doing extraordinary evil? What does meaning have to do with preventing that? He drew on Carl Jung, on Friedrich Nietzsche, on Alexander Solzhenitsyn, on the ancient narrative structures embedded in religious texts from across human civilization. For most of his career, he was a respected figure inside academia and almost completely unknown outside it. That changed in 2016 when the Canadian government introduced proposed legislation around compelled speech and gender pronouns. Peterson recorded a series of video lectures objecting to what he described as ideological overreach by the state. He posted them online. The response was immediate, massive, and came from both directions with equal force. Millions of people celebrated him as someone who had finally said what they believed. Others condemned him as dangerous and regressive. He did not retreat. He leaned in. And in doing so, he stepped from the lecture hall into the center of one of the most turbulent cultural debates of the decade. In 2018, his book 12 Rules for Life was published. It sold over 5 million copies in its first year, and eventually more than 10 million copies worldwide. The book was not a political document. It was a guide to personal responsibility, to meaning, to the navigation of suffering, written by a man who had spent decades studying both the clinical and the mythological dimensions of human struggle. It reached people who were hungry, desperate even, for someone to take the difficulty of being alive seriously. Sold-out tours followed, hundreds of interviews, a second book published in 2021, a podcast with millions of subscribers, a cultural presence so large that entire academic departments were devoted to critiquing him while entire communities were devoted to defending him. But beneath all of it, beneath the lectures and the book sales and the debates and the headlines, something else had been quietly building for a very long time. Depression runs in the Peterson family. Not the ordinary sadness that passes with time and light. Something deeper and more structural. In Peterson's own words, the kind of depression that could make it impossible to get off the couch for 30 years. His grandfather carried it. His father carried it. Each one finding different ways to survive it. Different ways to keep standing under a weight that most people never have to feel. Peterson first began taking antidepressant medication in the 1990s. The depression at that time was severe enough to affect his ability to lecture, to think clearly, to function in the way his professional life required. His doctors told him what doctors told nearly everyone at the time, that the medication corrected a chemical imbalance, that it was essentially like a vitamin for a system that was deficient. He believed them. He had no reason not to. For years, the medication appeared to help. The darkness receded enough for him to work. He built his career on that borrowed stability. Writing, teaching, researching, raising his family with his wife Tammy, watching his daughter Michaela and his son Julian grow up, and then Tammy became gravely ill. She was diagnosed with a rare form of kidney cancer. Her doctors initially told the family she had months to live. The weight of that possibility, the terror of losing the woman who had been at the center of his life for decades, pushed Peterson's doctors to add a new medication. A benzodiazepine called clonazepam, prescribed for the anxiety and sleeplessness that had become unbearable under the strain of his wife's illness. He did not take it for pleasure. He took it because the people responsible for his care told him it was the appropriate medical response to a situation that was genuinely overwhelming. He had not slept. The fear was consuming him. The medication seemed like the only rational option. It was the beginning of the worst chapter of his life, though no one understood that at the time. What Peterson and his family did not know, what most patients and what most doctors still do not fully understand, is that benzodiazepines are among the most dependency-forming substances in modern pharmacology. Not in the way the word addiction is commonly understood. Not a craving for pleasure. Something more insidious and more biological. The brain physically restructures itself around the presence of the drug. Remove it too quickly, or discover that it is causing more damage than it is treating, and the nervous system reacts with a violence that has almost no parallel in ordinary medical experience. By late 2019, it had become clear that the clonazepam was doing more harm than good. The decision was made to stop. Peterson traveled to Russia specifically to undergo a medically supervised detox under sedation, a process so physically extreme, so devastating to the body, that it required intensive clinical management just to survive the initial phase. He came home in January of 2020. He had not been on any psychiatric medication since that date. 5.5 years of recovery. Slow, painful, nonlinear, but real. By the accounts of everyone close to him, he had rebuilt himself on the far side of something that would have broken most people completely. Tammy had survived her cancer. The family had endured what felt like an impossible sequence of catastrophes and emerged, scarred but intact, into something that at least resembled stability. And then, in 2025, both of Peterson's parents died within the same year. Grief alone would have been crushing for anyone. But for a nervous system that had already been permanently marked, it now appears, by years of pharmacological injury, grief was not simply an emotional experience. It was a physiological trigger. Add to that a move across countries. The sale of the family home that held decades of memory and meaning. And then exposure to mold. A factor that in people with a specific genetic susceptibility, a condition called chronic inflammatory response syndrome, can cause the mitochondria themselves to begin shutting down, generating a cascade of neurological symptoms that most doctors are not trained to recognize and almost inevitably misdiagnose as something else entirely. The old injury woke up. And this time, it came back harder. The first signs appeared in August of 2024. They did not announce themselves with drama. They arrived the way most medical crises arrive in people who have already survived so much. Quietly. Ambiguously. Wearing the face of something manageable. Neurological discomfort. Sensitivity. The kind of symptoms that in isolation could be explained away as stress, as grief, as the ordinary physical toll of loss and displacement. His family did not immediately recognize what was happening. Neither did his doctors. For approximately 6 months, the condition was misdiagnosed repeatedly. By specialists. By hospitals. By the kind of medical professionals that a family like Peterson's turns to precisely because they are supposed to catch what ordinary doctors miss. The symptoms were real and visible and debilitating, but the framework being used to understand them was wrong. And in the gap between the reality of what his body was experiencing and the medical system's ability to correctly name it, Peterson got worse. Then he contracted pneumonia. Pneumonia alone in a man of 63 with a compromised nervous system would have been serious. But the pneumonia progressed to sepsis, a systemic infection that floods the body with an inflammatory response so severe it can shut down organs within hours. Peterson was hospitalized. His family, already stretched to the absolute edge of what fear and exhaustion can ask of human beings, faced the very real possibility that this might be the end. He survived the sepsis. He survived the pneumonia. But the medications administered during that hospitalization, well-intentioned, medically standard, chosen by doctors who did not yet have the full picture of what his nervous system had already endured, made the underlying neurological condition significantly worse. It was only after that deterioration, after the compounding of one misdiagnosis upon another, that the family finally understood what they were actually looking at. Akathisia. The same condition Peterson had experienced in 2020 and 2021 during the worst of his withdrawal. It had returned, not because of any new medication, not because of any choice he had made, but because a nervous system that had been neurologically injured years earlier had been pushed by grief and stress and environmental exposure, and a medical system that did not know what it was treating back into the same state of intolerable internal torment. To understand what Jordan Peterson has been enduring, you have to understand what akathisia actually is. Not the clinical definition that reduces it to a single word. Not restlessness. Because that word is so catastrophically inadequate that his daughter Michaela has said that calling it restlessness makes her want to hurt people. Akathisia is a neurological state of intolerable internal agitation. The person experiencing it cannot sit still, cannot lie down comfortably, cannot find a position, a room, a moment of the day that offers any relief at all. It is not anxiety in the way most people understand anxiety. A racing mind, a tight chest, a fear that eventually passes. Akathisia is a physical sensation of torment that lives inside the body itself. It has no external source, and therefore it has no external solution. There is nowhere to go to escape it because the source of the suffering is the nervous system itself. Michaela has described her own experience of akathisia, a milder version than her father's, in terms that are almost impossible to absorb. A sense of impending doom stronger than anything that can be naturally felt. A physical sensation of falling. Days when the only thing that provided any comfort was wrapping her arms around herself and rocking back and forth. A restlessness not just in her legs, but throughout her entire body. Everything she looked at appeared pixelated. She could not perceive color properly. Music hurt her ears. Light hurt her eyes. Smells became overwhelming. She could not watch television. She could not lie in a bed. She could only exist in a dark room and try not to panic. There was no comfortable position. There was no relief. And she describes her experience as significantly less severe than her father's. Jordan Peterson's akathisia, by his daughter's account, is worse than that. For a man who built his entire life and his entire legacy on the power of language, on the ability to find precise words for imprecise and terrible human experiences, to be inside a condition that defeats language entirely carries its own particular cruelty. He has spent his career telling people that naming the darkness is the first step toward facing it. That the stories we tell about suffering give us the tools we need to survive it. Akathisia does not respond to naming. It does not respond to frameworks or mythological structures, or any of the intellectual tools Peterson has spent decades building and offering to the world. It lives beneath all of that. It is biological. It is neurological. In Michaela's words, it is a mitochondrial injury. Damage at the most fundamental level of cellular function, where the energy systems of the nervous system itself have been disrupted so severely that the body cannot regulate its own internal state. And this is the aspect of Peterson's condition that his family most urgently wants the world to understand. Not as gossip, not as a celebrity cautionary tale, as a medical reality that is far more common than the medical establishment has been willing to acknowledge. 1 in 6 Americans is currently on a psychiatric medication, possibly more, depending on which study you look at. The majority of those people have been on their medication for more than 5 years. Most of them were told when they started that the medication was safe, that it corrected a chemical imbalance, that long-term use carried no significant risk. The emerging research on psychiatric medications and mitochondrial dysfunction is not fringe science. It is not the kind of material that lives on conspiracy websites. It is peer-reviewed research published in credible scientific journals showing that long-term use of certain psychiatric medications, particularly selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and benzodiazepines, appears to cause measurable damage to the mitochondria, the energy-producing structures inside cells. Damage that can manifest as a lasting neurological injury. Damage that can persist long after the medication has been stopped. Damage that can be reactivated years later by sufficient physiological stress. That is what happened to Jordan Peterson. The additional layer, the one that connects his neurological vulnerability to the mold exposure that his family believes triggered this relapse, involves chronic inflammatory response syndrome, a real and documented condition in which exposure to certain biotoxins, including mold, triggers a systemic inflammatory response that causes the mitochondria to essentially go into protective hibernation, shutting down to shield themselves from the toxin. The result is a cascade of symptoms, neurological, cognitive, and physical, that are notoriously difficult to diagnose because they closely mimic so many other conditions. Michaela believes this genetic susceptibility to mold illness may itself be connected to the severe intergenerational depression that has run through her family for generations. The kind of depression that did not respond to diet and exercise. The kind that was present in her great-grandfather, her grandfather, her father, and herself. Not a weakness of character. Not a failure of will. A biological vulnerability passed down through generations that the medical system treated with medications that over decades created a different, and in some ways more devastating, problem than the one they were prescribed to address. The road to recovery from a condition like this is not a medical procedure. There is no surgery. There is no prescription. There is no intervention that makes it faster or cleaner or less brutal. Recovery requires time, and it requires the absolute avoidance of anything that provokes a reaction in the already injured nervous system. Certain foods, certain supplements, certain medications, stress, mold, artificial additives, preservatives. It requires the kind of strict dietary discipline that Peterson and Michaela have both practiced for years. In their case, a diet consisting almost entirely of meat, arrived at not by ideology, but by the painful process of elimination that a hypersensitive post-injury nervous system demands. It requires above all patience and faith, and the willingness to endure without knowing exactly when the endurance will end. Michaela has said that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Now that the correct diagnosis has finally been made. Now that the right specialists are involved. Now that the family understands what they are dealing with, and what must be avoided. The same slow healing that happened once before can, they believe, happen again. The body and the brain do want to recover. Given the right conditions and enough time, they can. But Peterson is not there yet. Every single day of the last year has been, in Michaela's words, hell. She has not posted podcasts regularly because until a few days before she recorded the video update she finally shared with the world, she had cried every single day without exception. Her brother is under enormous stress. Her mother is exhausted. The family that has already survived so much is being asked to survive this. And Peterson himself, the man at the center of all of it, is enduring something that his own life's work, for all its depth and honesty and hard-won insight, could not have fully prepared him for. He has read Solzhenitsyn on the Gulag. He has lectured on Job. He has spent decades with the literature of extreme human suffering, extracting from it every lesson it has to offer about how to endure what cannot be changed and find meaning in what cannot be escaped. Now he is living it. Not in the abstract. Not in a lecture hall. In his body. In his nervous system. In the silence between one painful moment and the next, where no framework fits and no words help, and the only thing that remains is the bare, stubborn, biological fact of still being here. There is a kind of courage that has no audience. Not the courage of the stage. Not the courage of the man who stands before a hostile crowd and refuses to back down, who takes an unpopular position and holds it while the world screams at him to let go. That kind of courage has its own reward. The recognition that the stand meant something. The knowledge that the world saw it and was changed by it. The courage Jordan Peterson is practicing right now has none of that. It is the courage of the ordinary morning. Of waking up inside a body that has become an unreliable and often hostile environment and choosing, again and again, to remain present. To eat the carefully prescribed meals. To avoid the triggers. To rest when rest is possible, and to endure when it is not. To trust, on the days when trust feels completely impossible, that the nervous system that was injured can, given enough time and the right conditions, find its way back to something livable. It is the courage that no one writes books about. And yet, by any honest measure, it may be the hardest kind there is. His wife Tammy, who survived a cancer diagnosis that initially gave her months to live, who converted to Catholicism in 2023, who has been described by everyone who knows the family as a figure of extraordinary strength, is there. His daughter Michaela, pregnant and exhausted and grieving and at times furious, is there. His son Julian is there. The family that has already been tested beyond what most families are ever asked to bear is holding together around the man at the center of the storm. Faith has entered the Peterson household in ways that would not have been easy to predict a decade ago. Tammy's conversion. Michaela's Christian faith, which she found 2 years before her mother. Peterson himself, who has spoken publicly and at length about the importance of religious narrative, about the psychological truth embedded in the stories that Western civilization built itself upon, without ever formally identifying himself as a believer in the institutional sense. What he believes now, in the privacy of his suffering, is not something the public has access to. But those close to him say that faith, however he holds it, in whatever form it takes for a man of his intellectual complexity, has become something he is leaning on in ways he may not have fully anticipated. Michaela has said plainly, with the directness that has always defined her, that without the strength of the family's love for her father, without their faith, without the communication skills they have built through years of navigating crisis together, this would have crushed them. It has not crushed them. It has come very close. But it has not. There is something else this story carries. Something that extends far beyond one man's illness. However significant that man has been to the cultural conversation of the last decade. Michaela's video is not simply a family health update. It is, in her own explicit framing, a warning. Directed at the millions of people currently taking psychiatric medications who have never been told what long-term use may do to their mitochondria. Who have never been told that stopping too quickly can cause neurological injury that lasts for years. Who have never been told that the symptoms of that injury are almost always misdiagnosed as a return of the original condition, leading to more medications, more damage, and more suffering in a cycle that no one planned and almost no one recognizes for what it is. She is not anti-medicine. She is not telling anyone to stop taking their medications. She is saying that people deserve to know the risks before they begin. That informed consent, the foundational ethical principle of modern medicine, is not being honored in the way psychiatric medications are currently prescribed and monitored. Peterson has always said that what is true is useful. That the willingness to look at reality clearly, however uncomfortable it is not pessimism but the only honest form of hope. This is the reality. It is uncomfortable. And looking at it clearly, understanding what akathisia is, understanding what psychiatric medications can do over years of use, understanding that recovery is possible but requires knowledge that the medical system is not currently providing, may be the most genuinely useful thing anyone watching or listening to this can take away. For Peterson, the road forward is slow and nonlinear and without guarantees. The right specialists are now involved. The family understands what they are dealing with. The conditions for recovery are in place. He has come back from a place this dark before. He has rebuilt himself on the far side of suffering that would have ended many people. The body and the brain, as Michaela says, do want to recover. There is light at the end of the tunnel. But right now, Jordan Peterson is not a symbol. He is not a cultural figure or a philosophical proposition. He is a 63-year-old man inside a neurological condition of extraordinary severity, being held up by the people who love him, reaching as all human beings ultimately must for something beyond what he can manage alone. And in that, stripped of the books and the lectures and the global fame and the cultural wars fought in his name, he is exactly what he has always said every human being is at their core. Fragile, finite, in need of meaning, in need of each other, and still standing.